various topics. But we wanted to start with the computer science SOLs because they're really at the core of where a lot of schools are right now in terms of what they're doing. So in the chat window, if you haven't joined in there yet, there is a link to the notes page, and that's publicly available. It has all the links we'll be using this session. And once we're done, I'll add the slides into there also so you can access those. So as we're going, if you have any questions, please just type them in the chat window and I'll stop every couple slides and just make sure we're all up to speed. So we're good to go. All right. So I'm playing around. You know how it is when you try a new interface? Okay, sorry. Just trying to figure out how to switch slides on this without drawing all over everything. All right, so just a quick beginning. My name is Rebecca Dovey. I am the Director of Education for CodeVA. We are a statewide nonprofit here in Virginia working to bring computer science education to all Virginia students. And so some of you may have seen the Digital Dominion Map. That was something we did in partnership along with the Virginia's for Computer Science Lovers campaign with the Virginia Tourism Commission, and it spotlights just all sorts of different areas across the state where we have computer science things going on. One of the things I think people are very surprised to learn about Virginia is we have the highest concentration of jobs in computing in the United States. And, you know, most people, you kind of think Silicon Valley, you might think New York City. We don't tend to think about Virginia as being a technology hub. But the fact is we really, really are. There are jobs all over the state that are currently sitting open because we don't have students prepped to be able to fill those jobs. So that is the background of a lot of why the standards happened in the last year. So the last time we pulled data, it's around 44,000 open jobs right now, which is a pretty huge number. You know, as a comparison, like Arkansas, who we nationally do some work with, they're about 1,400. So huge difference just in terms of scale. All right. So CodeVA by the numbers, we started in 2013 and we've been doing teacher training ever since. We were Code.org's very first regional affiliate, and so we've been doing training with them from the beginning. So if you've done Hour of Code or any of the other Code.org programs, we're their representative here in state. And so since we started back in 2013, 2014, we've trained over 1,600 teachers across the state. And this number is actually a little outdated. We've added a few new districts, but we're in about 59% of the districts across the state. And so we're really working to make sure that teachers and school districts and parents have the information they need and the tools and resources they need going forward. We actually have a great team of facilitators who help us with our trainings. All of our facilitators are classroom teachers. We're very committed to really being a teacher organization. So really making sure that whoever's presenting and those kinds of things are really grounded in what it's like to be a classroom teacher. Several of those facilitators that work with us also were on the team that helped write the SOLs for the DOE. And that's one of the things I think that's the strongest here in Virginia about how we do standards is those standards are written by a committee of classroom teachers. It's not sort of a bunch of academics or, you know, bureaucrats. It really is grounded with classroom teachers. And so I hope as we go through the standards and you learn a little bit more about how they're structured, you'll see that teacher voice coming through. There are a lot of little nuances that they embedded into those standards that came out of conversations around making sure that our Virginia teachers were really able to actually implement this and would not be overwhelmed with the new mandate. So just a little bit of background. The law originally passed in 2016. For anybody who might be listening in from out of state, Virginia has a part-time legislature. We do a biennial budget, which means every other year they set a budget. And so that means they meet for about 8 weeks during that time. On the years where they're not doing the budget, those are the odd years, they only meet for about 6 weeks. And so it's a very tight deadline. So the law originally was passed in 2016. And then in the spring of 2017, they actually seated the first committee that started working on the draft. So it's a group of elementary, middle, and high school teachers all working together. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the processes that were used as they wrote and sort of where they're pulling things from. But it was a great team of people. They started meeting last March. And basically by June, couple months later, they had their first draft that went before the board in July. And so it was a very, very tight turnaround. During that time, there are multiple external review committees that sit. This is very typical for SOLs here in Virginia. And so there was a group of teachers that came in and reviewed the standards and gave feedback. We had feedback from universities. We had feedback from other education stakeholders. So the Department of Juvenile Justice, universities, Superintendents Association, anybody that has any sort of foot in public education here in Virginia had the opportunity to come in and comment. And then the final external review committee was actually with technological experts. So these are people who are professional coders. They own software development companies. We had some really big companies with thousands of employees in state, and, you know, literally little mom and pop shop with, you know, little tiny companies and everything in between. And so they were really looking at the standards from the point of view of them as people who work in the field, making sure that what they saw was technologically accurate, was as up to date as it could possibly be, and also could weather the kind of rapid changes that we see. You know, as we know, education moves a little more slowly in terms of change than the technology field. And so trying to get them to think about it from a lens of not what jobs do I have open right now, but think instead over the long run, you know, over the last 5 to 10 years, what changes have I seen? Over the next 5 to 10 years, what changes might we expect? And make sure that what they were seeing in terms of standards could weather the kinds of changes that they see. And we've got a link here to the standards if you haven't had a chance to look at them. Actually, while I'm kind of get started on standards, I want to launch our poll. So if you have a second, just curious to see how many folks have actually looked at the standards. So clicking on them, you should be able to see, let me make sure this is correct. Okay, it looks like it's showing it correctly. So this is the Department of Education page. It looks like all the other standards pages we have. So you can download them as a whole or by grade band, and then we've got the electives down here at the bottom. And there's some unique things about how these are structured, so we'll go through and talk about what those are. Also, they've got their computer science instruction page here with some additional resources. So CodeVA is right there, code.org is here, CSTA, and then it's got some of the background on sort of where the legislation came from. And if you're really ever curious and want to actually read the legislation itself, you can get into the actual legal piece right there. One of the things in Virginia is standards are owned by the Department of Education. And so there is a piece of legislation that defines what has to be taught in Virginia public schools. And so when they added computer science, they added it at the level of core standards. So if you read through the legislation, when you hit the point where they're talking about every child shall learn math, English, social studies, all of those things, computer science was injected in that level. And that has some impact on how those standards will be structured. You'll notice that it comes, if you're a policy wonk and feel like reading the whole thing, you'll notice it comes before things like PE and art and some of the other enrichment programs that are also required to be in there. So they're really intended to be at the core level, which again impacts how we're going to see those as they go through. All right, just checking real quick. Doesn't look like we have any questions. All right, so it looks like about almost 40% of you have read the standards, and then another 40% have kind of skimmed them. You know, I'm curious just if you have a moment to share in the chat room, if there's anything that you were really surprised to see in the standards. I'd love to hear about it. So our starting point, just like any other field, is we started by looking at the national documents. So there's sort of two sets of documents that really influence what computer science looks like at the elementary through high school level. And I think I neglected to mention, because of the legislation that passed, Virginia is the first state in the country to have mandatory standards. Because of where this was injected into the standards of learning legislation, this is not optional. This is something that every student starting in kindergarten will have to start doing. While we are the first, a lot of other states are moving that direction. There are several bills up in other states around the country. So right now we are kind of a model for how other states may approach this, but we're certainly will not be standing alone for very long. Internationally speaking, most industrialized countries have already moved this direction. So this is an area the United States actually does need to catch up in. So at the top level, and unfortunately I kind of put these backwards, you have the framework. So just like any curriculum, you have a framework that defines what should and should not be covered. We're going to look at this real quickly just so you can get a sense. So this is the framework. If you want to actually get into the framework itself, They've got a really nice interface, so you can look by grade band, by concept, by progression. I'm going to actually start with the concepts here. And so, it gives a little bit of explanation of sort of how they're set up. And then if we go here to grade band, we can actually start kind of poking around in here. Now, one of the things you'll notice that's going to be different than the national standards and the Virginia standards is both the K-12 framework and the CSTA standards. Those are the Computer Science Teachers Association standards. Both of those are done in sort of these bands. So it's kindergarten through second grade, third through fifth, sixth through eighth, and then high school. So if we go to third through fifth here, you'll see that they have these strands, so computing systems, networks, and the internet. And then you've got sort of their idea, like for hardware and software, what should be covered at that point, okay? One of the things that was decided very early on in terms of the standards writing was, since these are mandatory, having that kind of grade band, the fear would be that that would be confusing. So if you're a second grade teacher, the team really wanted to make sure that anybody coming in from first grade had a really solid, that second grade teacher knows, like, okay, this is what was supposed to happen in first and second. There's also concern, I know we have other standards in state where, you have those grade bands, and having done, my role when I was in the district level, I worked as a technology coach for several years, and I know sometimes what happens, you get a couple snow days in there and you start falling behind, and it's easy for basically those things to get pushed off, and then all of a sudden that second or third grade teacher is sort of dumped with several years worth of things they're supposed to be doing. So we wanted to make sure that these were really bite-sized chunks. It kept it from being as overwhelming, and it also really tried to make clear what is the difference between third and fourth grade. Where should students be exactly at fifth grade? All of those kind of delineations. So if we flip over here, the CSTA standards, again, that's the Computer Science Teachers Association. They have just finalized their draft. When we were working last spring, these were still in draft mode, but they've finalized those. So they've got some really good information here if you're ever curious about it. One of the things you'll notice, though, is not everything in the CSTA standards are in the Virginia standards. And the decision was made pretty early on that even though there's sort of this national document, one of the things that can happen, and I know you've all at some point served on a committee, is you get a lot of ideas on the table, and unless there's some urgency around, oh, we're going to actually have to act on all of these, it's easy to kind of not trim anything out. And so because our teachers here in state are having to actually implement over the next few years, it made a lot of sense to really tighten up that list and make sure that it was a smaller, manageable chunk. Just like everything else in Virginia, these standards will come up for review, and it'll be a group of teachers that sit down and give feedback and write the revisions. And so over time, we may see these start to grow in terms of number of standards like you see at the national level, or the decision, 7 years from now could be these are exactly where they need to be. That's one of the things about being sort of at the forefront of this, is there's a lot of experimentation. We just don't really know quite where these need to sit. Okay, so a question just popped up. Will they be tested? So at this point, no. That was actually something, it was in the original legislation, and we as an organization and several other groups really advocated to get rid of the testing. One other thing, and you may be asked this back in your districts, is originally the legislation suggested a graduation requirement. That has also been removed. So right now they will not be tested. One thing we may see, though, is they are aligned with core standards. So let's say several years from now, the math standards are up for review. If the two teams decide to sort of align the language where some of the computer science standards inform what's in the math standards, in that situation, if those core math standards change, in theory, multiple years down the line, you could see something on a standardized test. But that's a very abstract maybe. Right now, the answer is no. They are not tested. The way that the mandate is happening is, coincidentally, this last year, the state's school accreditation standards were up for renewal. I don't believe those have been voted on yet. I think that's in the next few months. But one of the things they do when they do school accreditation standards is they go back over the last period of time and look for any legislation that's passed that would impact things. And this piece of legislation falls in that category. So the draft, if you want to go look at it at the DOE website, the draft for the school accreditation standards has a little blurb in there about how schools have to demonstrate that they're meeting these standards. So that's sort of where we talk about like mandate. It's more at that level. For us as an external organization, just very strongly felt like the last thing we needed was more testing. So, you know, and honestly, this is completely brand new. We haven't added a whole new strand to K-12 education in probably 100 years. So we're not really at a point, you know, in math, we have a really good sense of, you know, what a student in 5th grade is going to struggle with and where their strengths and weaknesses tend to be. We just don't know those things in computer science yet because it's such a new field. And so to hop all the way to then having standardized testing was fortunately something that was able to be negotiated out. Okay, so these are the national documents. They're interesting only if you're really interested in kind of seeing where they came from. So when we look at computer science here in Virginia, basically there's 6 strands. This is a little bit different. When we were working with the CSTA draft standards last spring had 5 strands. One of the decisions made here locally was to pull cybersecurity out to make it its own strand. And the rationale for that is, again, it was kind of tucked in with networks and the internet, and they're not really quite the same thing. They certainly relate, but they're not the same thing. And especially as we are trying to inch kids towards high school, and kids perhaps might want a job, and you know, that's one of the major areas that has just huge amount of open opportunities for kids in state. We really felt like those standards should be articulated separately. When you look through the elementary, there might be 1 or 2 cybersecurity strands a year, most of them around things like online safety and passwords, which are things we're already doing at the elementary level. But just trying to get kids used to the idea of what is cybersecurity? That's a job. What's interesting about that? So that student, by the time they hit 8th grade, if that's something they've been interested in, they could then decide to take an elective and perhaps the CTE department and really pursue that as a possible career. Let's see. Data gathering. You know, that's one of the big open questions right now in terms of gathering. The question is, how will data be gathered and measured to know if they're making an impact? You know, that's actually kind of the $50 million question right now. Organizationally, we do a lot of training, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in the webinar about what we offer around that. And so for us as an organization, we do a lot of surveying of the people that we do training with. How much autonomy is allowed for interpretation of the standards? This is just like everything else in Virginia, and especially since right now they're not tested. Curricular decisions are always at the division level in Virginia. And so, you know, it's going to depend a little bit on what school division you're in. Some school divisions, you know, tend to do very rigid pacing guides and everybody's sort of similarly on the same lesson plan. Some school divisions, teachers have a little bit more classroom autonomy. So that piece really is going to be more at the division level than at the state level. The state's mandate really is to maintain standards and to communicate clearly what those standards are. And then anything about implementation really is up to the locality. So, you know, I think that's one of the big open questions I personally have is really seeing how school divisions attack this as we kind of move over the next few years. We're actually piloting a program right now that I'll talk about later in the webinar about it's training elementary computer science coaches. So it's people that go into divisions and train people to do professional development. So it might be an instructional resource teacher or a STEM coordinator, some of the folks in the cohort are librarians and media specialists. Some are classroom teachers that are just taking on an additional role. And so that's actually one of the pieces that's been really interesting as we work. I think right now, it's probably about 12 to 14 different school districts that are represented in that pilot group. And it's very, very interesting to see how different that piece is from division to division. So again, as you're looking at these, just kind of keep an eye out for the fact that the cybersecurity piece is going to be separate in terms of if you're comparing resources to some things nationally. So again, that one is different than some of the other standards. Okay, all right. Apparently, I need to clean the screen. I have not done annotation on this. Okay, there we go. Whoops. So overall, the structure is from kindergarten through 8th grade, they're meant to be integrated into core instruction. And we'll look at some examples of what that means. At the middle school level, there was also an elective created, and that's optional for districts. They can offer the elective or not. And then at the high school level, there were 3 new electives offered. These are intended to be before the AP level. So if you're in a school district that already has high school computer science, maybe they've got the APCS principles course, these electives would sit before that in a sequence of classes. And then there are some other electives that already exist at the high school level. We'll go over those too, that already were on the books for computer science. So again, K through 8 is meant to be integrated, and then as you get towards middle and high school, it's this idea of an informed option. Really, a student who knows they want to go into a different field, we didn't want to impose, this is that idea of a graduation requirement. And there were 2 reasons organizationally we really opposed that idea of a grad requirement. Number one is a student should be, if they really, really, really want to go into nursing or another field, they need that time in their course structure to get as many classes in there as possible. And in theory, if they've done the whole K-8 and they've had it all the way throughout, they should know enough to know, okay, I really like this, or maybe I want to go a different direction. The other piece is too, just very practical. We've trained well over, I think it's over 600 middle and high school teachers now, and we know that we are nowhere near capacity. I was still in the classroom when the economics personal finance mandate hit, and I just know how bananas that was for everybody's schedule at the high school levels. They were scrambling to find enough teachers to try to cover those courses. So we wanted to leave people thinking happy thoughts. There's nowhere near the capacity in terms of having enough teachers to actually meet any kind of mandate there. So that's sort of the overall swell of how those are done. I'm just checking the chat window real quick. Oh, I missed this one. So looking forward to how they will be integrated with a multidisciplinary approach. Yep. And that really is that intention from kindergarten through 8th grade. That there are a lot of different structures. Again, it's up to that school division. We are actually going to be starting to do some curriculum this spring. And so the curriculum we are putting together will have that sort of interdisciplinary look to it. But again, it really is up to that division how they actually do that. And there are a lot of different, and I think, creative ways that can be approached. So we talk about integrated, just an integrated curriculum. It's described as one that connects different areas of study. So, traditionally we've been very, very siloed in terms of, we do math over here, we do language arts over here, we do science over here. And this is this idea that students, should be learning about those relationships between the subjects. And, as the definition here says, it focuses on making connections for students, allowing them to engage in relevant, meaningful activities that can be connected to real life. And so that really is the spirit with which these integrated standards were written, that they should not necessarily be pull out over here by themselves. They're really a really rich way to add to existing curriculum. And, and some of this also goes back to just an issue of time. Teachers' days are very, very dense, as we all know. And so adding a whole nother field where it needs to be its own standalone chunk of time really is not realistic. So as we look at some of those integrations, I think that'll kind of spark some ideas for what that might look like. And there's some really strong models across the state. There are several divisions that have already started doing this. I know Virginia Beach has a lot of performance tasks at the elementary level that integrate computer science in with their elementary science units. So they've got some really creative ways that they're doing that. So there are just a lot of opportunities for really, really embedding this into what students are already doing and really enhancing what students are doing. All right, so this is just an example of what an integrated standard might look like. So this is the Computer Science 1.12, so this is first grade. So the student will identify and explain responsible behaviors associated with using information and technology. So, picture that's a first grade level. That's connected to Civics 1.10. So I didn't list all of the standard here. If you're really curious, you can go look them up. But it's that idea in first grade, students are also thinking about applying the traits of a good citizen. And so they're talking about fair play, good sportsmanship, helping others, treating others with respect, those types of things. That's a pretty clear cross-pollination between this idea of how do we act responsibly, treating others with respect, And again, as we know, that's important for our students, not just on the playground, but also in the digital realm also. So the earlier we can start to have those conversations, the better. And then again, those go on about recognizing the purpose of rules, practicing self-control, those types of things. So those two standards are meant to be integrated together. And you'll see in the standards documents where it lists related SOLs. My understanding is that the Department of Ed will be trying to do a crosswalk to really make those connections even more clear for folks. So I really am looking forward to seeing what comes out of that process, because I think just the more of those connections we can see, the better. Just pause real quick. Any questions so far? Okay. All right. So again, I think by kind of looking at this particular standard and then thinking about it in the lens of civics, like this is a civics lesson or a standard that teachers already are doing. It probably would not take a huge amount to make sure that it's also covering this idea of information and technology alongside that. So it's not meant to be, additional hours of instruction. It might just be a little tweak in an existing lesson or a series of activities that students are doing in order to meet the standard. And that's one of the things we'll see, especially in elementary school. So in elementary, there's sort of a divide between the coding standards and the non-coding standards. So for example, this is Computer Science 4.8. This is 4th grade. This would be a non-coding standard. It's another example of a possible integration. So the students will model how a computing system works, including input, output processors, and sensors. So how are computers getting information in and out? Science at that level, they're actually talking about the characteristics of electricity. So basic circuits, things like that. So starting to talk about how a computer physically works aligns really, really well with the idea of talking about basic circuits and electricity. There's a really nice overlap there. That was very, very intentional. So if you take the elementary standards, if you look at the algorithm and programming strand, sort of those are the coding strands, and kind of put that to the side, all of the other standards that are there are meant to be things that can be integrated with core classroom instruction. And that was something that was very, very intentional. They're very careful about not injecting anything that didn't have some sort of hook elsewhere in the curriculum. And when decisions were made, like when they went from those 3-5 bands and divided it out to 3, 4, and 5 grade level strips, those decisions were grounded in what are the existing SOLs at that grade level. So it's, if you ever really geek out on this and do a comparison between the national standards and our state standards, there are a couple things where they're at slightly different grade levels, but that's why. The decision was take these computer science topics that the framework and the standards nationally say students should be doing and attach them where there's a touch point that already exists in the SOLs. And so the feeling is, that idea of coding and that really starting coding off with young students, that's a big, heavy lift. That's a lot for everybody to learn how to do. And so all of the standards that are those non-coding standards really are meant to sort of align and dovetail nicely in with what's already happening in the classroom. A lot of them are actually almost word for word for core standards, especially when we look at some of the ones around cybersecurity and things like that. They're very much grounded in things that are already happening. Oh, thank you. So let's see, adding them to the crosswalk will make teachers more aware of the CS standards. Yes, yeah, absolutely. So I think that crosswalk document is really going to be important in terms of making those connections clear so that, it's overwhelming. If you've never done this before, this isn't your background, really giving a clear place about, okay, this is where I can start to plug it in. I think the other thing to really keep in mind too, is it doesn't have to be all or nothing. I know one of the divisions we're working with right now, their decision this year was to really start their teachers with the data and analysis strand. There are a lot of beautiful overlaps there between both science and math and even some social studies pieces there. And so just to get every teacher sort of really familiar with that and work on that for a year, and then next year they'll add another strand. So there are a lot of different approaches. That's a really nice thing, since we're not staring at a test with this. There's not like, there's no squad of ninjas that's going to be going around and saying like, why aren't you doing all of these? So I think there's a lot of ability for localities to really get creative about how do they approach this and really, really build this intentionally. Yeah, and again, going back to that intentionality of the standards and the alignment per grade level, that's the beauty of having classroom teachers actually working and writing this. That team of people, they were so determined to get this right as possible for everybody. And that was something, there were a couple pieces that they were really adamant on. That was one. Another thing that we'll see, and I think this is really interesting, is anywhere there's vocabulary in the standards, this probably took the most time, is the wordsmithing, making sure that vocabulary is consistent and it's technically accurate. That really making sure that if you need to, you can highlight computing system and Google that and get a very clear definition of what is a computing system and what is not a computing system. Like what is output, what is input, what is a processor, what is a sensor, those types of things. They really, really work to make sure there's no ambiguity there. And that's one of the things then I think long-term as we start to implement is sort of talking about that separation between the vocabulary in the standards is meant to inform what students will be learning, but it's really meant for the teacher so that the teacher knows exactly the marker they need to hit. Whereas, in fourth grade, would you necessarily use the vocabulary computing system? Maybe, maybe not. That phrase computing system shows up all the way down in the kindergarten, first grade standards. I wouldn't necessarily expect a kindergartner to know the vocabulary computing system. Maybe, depends. But possibly by third, fourth, fifth grade, that should be some vocab that they're starting to use correctly. So that's another area where that scaffolding with the curriculum side, and again, some of those crosswalk pieces, to start to clarify, like, okay, we can talk about things in a general way with students, and then when is it that we expect them to start using some of that technical vocabulary? And that's something I think that's really going to develop over time. And it goes back to that data piece of really working closely with teachers and getting their feedback about what's working in their classroom and hearing stories. So this is an example, again, of that non-coding integration piece. So very, very intentional in terms of those chunks. So next piece was talking a little bit about the elementary coding. I know this is a piece where I'm just from all of the teacher training we're doing right now, we get a lot of anxiety about this. So one really important thing I want to point out when you read this, and I think it's really easy to miss if you're not, so it's kind of a secret tip. If you're not looking for it, you don't know it's there. For kindergarten and first grade, coding can be done as a group or a whole class activity. So I dragged that piece in italics directly out of the standards. It says either independently or collaboratively. That was done for several reasons. First of all, not every kindergartner is reading yet. And so, there may be times where having them code independently in certain classrooms, that's just not going to work. Also, there's a lot of sensitivity to the fact that there's a huge variation across the state in terms of devices. You have some divisions that are very device heavy. They've just got a great infrastructure there. You've got other divisions that aren't quite there yet. I know we see some divisions where students don't regularly start using devices until third grade with testing. There's just an enormous amount of difference across the state. And so they were really, really intentional about trying to make sure that these were written so that every district across the state should be able to implement this. I think another thing to really think about here is coding does not necessarily only mean that you're doing something on the computer. And I think that's something that's a real strong misnomer, that coding and programming have to be on a device. There are a lot of great what we call unplugged activities where you can talk about step-by-step activities. If you've ever seen that old, making the peanut butter and jelly sandwich where you write out the instructions, that's a great example that you can do. And there are a lot of variations that don't require peanut butter. But that's a great example of an activity that is unplugged that you can use to teach those ideas of coding. But again, either independently or collaboratively. So if in that district, if with those students, if in this particular classroom it works better, it can be a teacher with a small group where the kids are giving input, but the teacher's steering the coding at that moment. Or it could be an unplugged activity that all the students are participating in. Yeah, and just a question popped up. Is there a state plan to support the infrastructure enhancement, i.e. devices, internet access? I do know that there are some initiatives around internet, and that's not specifically related to this particular project. In terms of devices, I am not that I am aware of, beyond what they already do for sort of SOLs and testing. So really, again, that comes up to division by division in terms of what's there. And again, that goes back to Virginia kind of being a bottom-up and local control state, where those really are meant to be local decisions. All right, so talking about the coding, so kindergarten, first grade, it's either independently or collaboratively. By second grade, there's a really important shift here, both independently and collaboratively. So by second grade, students should be doing some independent coding. And then as they go through, you'll see that there's more and more emphasis on students really being able to code independently. Now, that collaboratively can be interpreted a lot of different ways. Collaboratively could be a teacher and a small group working together. It could be two students coding together in pair programming. There are a lot of different models for how that can work. But there is this shift by second, third, fourth grade where students should be starting to learn the code independently, where they know it. They're not only working with a buddy or a partner or a group. Just check in the chat window. So many educators are already utilizing lessons and activities that will meet many of these standards, especially the unplugged logic and problem solving skills. Exactly. That's the thing we find universally, and we do a lot of district level training. Work a lot with districts there. That's one of our big initiatives this year. And, you know, it's one of the activities we do in person with teachers is we do an SOL gallery walk where they go through the SOLs and they list out like what they're covering and what they're not. And you kind of just walk around the room and you could just feel the room kind of relax. It's like, oh, we're actually doing a lot of this already. There's so many areas where I think Virginia, we're very, very fortunate because we have a lot of pieces in place where teachers are already, you know, doing little bits and pieces. Some of this is really just going to be at the school level, kind of connecting those dots and really being cohesive with it. Yep. But absolutely, there are tons and tons of just areas where we already are doing these things. So, but in any case, so that's kind of that's a very popular pro tip, is this idea of either independently or both independently. And I think on first read of the standards, a lot of people miss that it's phrased that way. So that can make you very popular when you go back and talk about this with some of your fellow teachers, that there is, you know, at kindergarten and first grade, you know, we're not demanding that every kindergartner is typing Python in independently. That would be a ridiculous ask. So there are a lot of different levels and ways for that particular thing to be implemented. All right, so any questions before we scoot on about what we're seeing in the elementary standards? Okay, and I'll keep checking the chat window. So if something pops into your head as we're going, just go ahead and plop it in. We can pause at any point. Okay, so switching over to middle school. At the middle school level, the standards are still meant to be integrated. And so, you know, they have just the same number of standards as they do at the elementary level. The big difference here, and I think this is where districts are going to have to really do kind of a deep dive and dig in, is at the elementary level, you know, that second grade classroom teacher really owns what that second grade classroom does. That's, you know, that's kind of their world. Even if they're team teaching and sharing, there's just a lot of that collaboration and conversation happening. So handing a teacher a set of standards, you know, they have a view pretty much of where those things are happening. When we get to middle school, where typically students are switching classes, even though there are these set standards, it's not necessarily they're not decided in terms of what subject area they go to. And so there are a lot of different ways to do that. And this actually was really probably the most challenging area in terms of actually creating the standards, because if you've ever looked from middle school to middle school across divisions, it is very variable how you see things. Like some divisions for science will have very much sixth grade science, you know, seventh grade, they do an earth science, very distinct classes. Some spiral through where every year students cover a little bit of earth, a little bit of physical, a little bit of life, and they repeat those all 3 years. And so that fact made really designing those middle school standards very, very tricky. They probably went through the most revisions out of all of them. But one of the things you'll notice is as you go through, each year kind of has a theme. So the sixth grade year, the theme is around data and thinking about like, how do we use data? What does data do? The seventh grade year is around the internet. And then the eighth grade year is around cybersecurity. Those are for a couple different reasons. First of all, it kind of gives those teachers a little bit of a hook, because again, because there's so much variability in how middle schools implement curriculum, there are going to have to be a lot of local decisions made in terms of which standards get placed in which subject areas. And so by having that theme, the hope was that could sort of help divisions and schools and classroom teachers start to kind of make some of those decisions. The second piece is, and there's an overall push with state around this right now, is trying to make sure middle school students are aware of different possible careers. And so it's that idea of career awareness. And so these are three areas. I mean, obviously being a computer programmer is a career, but there are a lot of other areas that people don't necessarily think of when they think of computing jobs. So being a data scientist, working with the internet, and cybersecurity are three very specific fields of study that are very computer science heavy, but they're not identified as being a computer scientist. And so the hope also is that, let's say a student's gone through and they've done all of these standards, they're at the 8th grade level, and they're ready to start choosing their high school electives. You know, you might have that student say, you know, I really am sick of coding. I don't want to do any more coding, but the cybersecurity stuff we covered was really interesting. I'm going to take that elective. Or, you know what, I really enjoy my science classes and I want to learn more about this data piece, and so I'm going to take these electives over here. So again, part of it was for the teachers to have a hook to kind of connect things onto. Yes, the alignment to, somebody just commented about the career awareness and secondary transition. Yep. And so, you know, it's not that we're trying to make 6th graders decide what you want to be when you grow up, but just making them aware, like these are different jobs. And if you want those jobs, you can start taking electives now so that you're getting as many things in place as possible while you're in high school. So really trying to get students and families and schools aligned on that piece. Oh, and then popping back, somebody spotlighted that Tinker is a great coding resource for elementary. Yep, those are, we've worked with them quite a bit. They're some really good tools. It's funny, when I first started teaching computer science back in the 90s, really we had QBasic. I don't know if anybody out here remembers QBasic, but that was the only tool. We used to go and do things at the elementary level. And that was the only tool we had at that point, apart from some kind of clunky robots and that kind of thing. And, you know, we're in this environment now where it's just so tool rich, it's almost overwhelming in trying to pick things. So, which, you know, too many tools is probably a better problem to have. Okay, so those are the middle school integrated. One other focus that you'll see, oh yeah, Scratch and Scratch Junior, love Scratch. So another focus that you'll notice as you go through there is you start to see language around modeling and simulation. Part of this is, I think a lot of times we tend to instantly think computer science, oh, it must be math, right? We always make that. I know I've used examples in this webinar multiple times today, probably accidentally. But there are a lot of other areas that really do relate. And so the idea here is that as they're building their coding skills, that we're also really using it in a practical way. So in 6th grade, the focus is on using an existing model to simulate things. In 7th grade, starting to refine an existing model. So you have your code and you change that code to fit different scenarios. And by 8th grade, the hope is that they would actually be able to create new models. And so there's a huge alignment there with science, but then also some real potential, I think, with social studies and some of those subject areas. All right. Okay. So at the middle school level, the team also defined an elective. And so again, this is optional. Schools do not have to offer this. But this, for us as an organization, this is one of our highest areas where we get requests. We get a lot of requests for middle school elective. So we do training. It's called CS Discoveries. We had a group go through this last year, our pilot group, and then we're hoping to run probably 3 or 4 cohorts of that this summer. So if you're in a district where you think that might be interesting, we certainly have free training and free curriculum available. So this is all about the options. This was probably the biggest head scratcher. We sat down and started collecting information about, you know, the beautiful mess that is middle school. One of the things we really quickly realized is electives in middle school are incredibly variable. So some schools do 6-week rotations, some have 9-week rotations, some do a semester, so that's the 18-week, and then some do year-long. Some do all 3, some it varies by grade level. It was kind of a whack-a-mole trying to pin down the way it should look. And so finally the team decided to basically build sort of these concentric circles. So at the core of the middle school elective is a 6-week option, and then you can add an extra set of things to get to the 9-week, and then the 18-week and the 13-week. And we'll look a little bit at what's in each of those pieces. But it's pretty unique. I can't think off the top of my head of any other courses defined by Virginia. Even in the CTE world, they'll have like a semester and a year-long option, but this idea of sort of a core subject that you add to as you go through, I think was a really unique way of solving this particular problem. So one of the concerns was for students at the middle school level, because it's harder with multiple teachers sort of owning the standards. So one of the concerns was to make sure that there still was a tight option for coding, because, you know, programming is sort of the tool that we use to do computer science. Computer science isn't just coding, but it's that tool that we use when we're working on the computer. So the 6-week core, if you're doing a rotation, is really focused on coding. And one of the things you'll notice is the language says it can be block or text-based. And I should have pointed that out at the elementary level. That's an option. Early elementary, it really talks about block-based, but by late elementary, if the decision is, you're welcome to use a text-based language. And there are a lot of reasons why you might use one or the other. But middle school, they left it up to choice. We'll see by the high school level, they need to be working in a text-based language. So that's a typed language like Python or Java or C++, something like that. Excuse me. The 9-week version, those 3 additional weeks, adds the impacts of computing. So that's an additional focus area for that 9-week course, is really talking about what those impacts are. And that was really a reflection of where students are in middle school. We're trying to kind of get them to think outside themselves and think about responsibility and sort of cross your fingers that it all sticks. And so really getting them to think about sort of the ethical implications of computing. In the 18-week course, they go ahead and it covers all 6 strands. So you'll see a little bit from each of the strands added. And then in the 36-year-long course, it goes into more depth in both the computing systems and the coding piece. So really kind of a deep dive in preparation for anybody that wants to move on for high school. All right. All right, before we move on to high school electives, any questions? Okay, so this is, do you see the middle school classes as exploratory on a rotation or as an option completely up to the students? Again, that's going to be a local decision. We know that there are some divisions that are deciding we're just going to make this a rotation and everybody does it. A lot of districts are kind of looking at those electives right now anyway, so it's kind of good timing. But then some districts, it's completely an elective. And there are districts where it's both. You might have a 6-week rotation that everybody does, and then there's a more in-depth version of this elective that's a full year-long elective or semester. So again, it's really going to depend. And it's very variable depending on staffing. In a very small district without as many elective teachers, sometimes it's harder to have as many options there. But again, that's going to be completely up to that local district. Okay, so at the high school level, we mentioned that there's an informed option. So the idea is that students that have come along should be able to choose if they want to continue. The feeling was, a lot of students know by high school that they really want to pursue certain fields and that they shouldn't be forced into doing career readiness in a field that doesn't necessarily align. I think going back to this idea of data collection, this is one of the areas that we're really curious about. Is there are a lot of fields now, and I think a lot of people are very surprised to know, only over 70% of jobs in STEM-related fields actually are computing jobs. The additional, roughly 30% of non-computer science jobs in STEM, a lot of those professions still use coding in terms of what they do. So when I have a brother-in-law who just finished his PhD in biology. He does his data collection where he collects DNA from fungi, excuse me. And then the rest of his year, he's looking for patterns in the DNA. Well, he's doing that using coding. So it's kind of become the Swiss Army knife for a lot of different STEM fields and even into things like economics, the arts, and things like that. So the hope is by the time they've hit 8th grade, they've had enough coding and computer science that if they end up taking a data science class while they're in college, or if they end up needing to do some modeling and simulation in a physics class later on, they've had enough coding that should be fairly easy to continue with. Okay. The other thing you'll notice when we get to the high school, as I mentioned, is we're now working in a text-based language. And so that doesn't mean block-based languages are banned. And again, there's no squad of ninjas out there enforcing things. You can certainly do your prototyping in a block-based language, but really by the time you're in high school, you should be starting to use professional grade tools. And so these classes are all language agnostic. It is completely up to that school and the division what language they want to do. And again, that's because staffing. If you have an AP Java teacher in your building, it may make the most sense to use Java because that's the language the person knows. If you have somebody who knows a little Python, that may make the most sense. It's completely up to the local implementation what language they choose. Again, that language is only the tool that we're using to get at the computer science concepts. Okay, so level 1, and I probably made a mistake here. They're not really level 1, level 2, level 3. You can put them in any order you want. You can pick any one you want. There's no imposition that they have to go in a particular order. So Computer Science Foundations is sort of a high school level Computer Science 101. It covers all of the core context, and it's specifically putting coding into the context of those broader computer science topics. So all of the things they've been covering through elementary and middle school, starting to get a little bit deeper and slightly more technical in their understanding. The next course is Computer Science Principles. This is a standard level course. So they called it Principles. It's not the same as AP Computer Science Principles. So it's meant to be used in a couple different ways. If a school has AP Computer Science Principles and they need a prerequisite, this course is an excellent prerequisite that could be put in place. One of the things we also see, and I know this used to happen to me all the time when I was teaching my AP Computer Science classes, a lot of times you'll have a certain group of kids in the year or in the room that want to take an AP level course, and a certain number of kids who really are there because they like the subject, but they don't want to take the AP exam. And so for districts where they do kind of that bifurcation, where you have both classes happening at the same time, you could put both of those subjects, you could put the AP and the standard level in the room at the same time. The subjects covered are very parallel, but the AP version goes into more depth because it's a college level course. So it really can work at a couple different implementations there. All right, and then the final one that they added is called Computer Science Programming. So this would be a good prerequisite. If you need a prerequisite for AP Computer Science A in Java, this would make an excellent prerequisite. And the idea here is it's covering all of the strands of computer science through the lens of coding. So whereas they've been learning about data and analysis, like in elementary school, they're collecting data and making graphs and things like that. By the time they get to this course, they really should be working with data through a programmatic lens, where they're doing programming is the tool that they're using to work on data. Programming is the tool that they're using to think about what's happening on the internet, those kinds of things. So it's really kind of coalescing all of those different strands they've been learning throughout the year, and again, or the years. And again, it's meant to be a good, solid prerequisite if a school offers AP Computer Science A in Java. And just like the middle school elective, I keep saying election instead of elective. I'm getting tongue-tied today. But just like all of the middle school elective, these are optional. There's no mandate that schools necessarily have to offer these. All students in state do have access to computer science electives through Virtual Virginia. So there is that option to take things. We're not really sure, like at this point, they're still trying to work out like what department they sit in, how do we map things, all of those kinds of things. So that's something that's sort of TBD by the Department of Education. But one thing I think to keep in mind is nothing's necessarily going away. So we have a lot of courses in state that already are used. So computer math is one that we see a lot of divisions use as a basically like a prerequisite or intro level course. Of course, there are the 2 AP classes, and I can't believe I forgot it because I used to teach it, but also International Baccalaureate Computer Science should sit here. And then there are a whole host of CTE courses. Some of them are primarily computer science, so like the CTE Verso course programming. And then there are other courses like IT Fundamentals that are meant to be sort of a survey course that cover a little networking, a little programming, a little internet, those kinds of things. So there are a lot of electives that already exist at the high school level. The decision was, though, that it was very confusing as you looked across districts whether or not they were offering computer science. And part of that is because of the naming. Like a district might be doing computer math and they might be doing some amazing algorithmic things, but because it's called computer math, we don't necessarily identify that as computer science. And so they decided to go ahead and identify these 3 elective courses. Over the next 2 years, CodeVA as an organization will be doing curricula for these previous 3 new courses, just to get some good modules and resources out there. All right, so I'm checking my timing and I'm kind of impressed with myself that we're almost on time here. So in terms of next steps, CodeVA does offer free training. We offer training all the way from elementary school through high school, and I'll talk a little bit about that. For folks at the district level that are just trying to wrap their head around all this and figure out where to get started, we're working on a project right now called a Computer Science Roadmap. We're currently piloting that with 5 districts, and then we'll be launching that with the next round over the next month. But that's basically, it's a series of questions that the district goes through and helps us do some data collection about what's happening in the district. And then we make some suggestions back, like, okay, you're offering these electives at the middle school level. Here's something you can kind of add on to help augment that. And I would say the last area in terms of just resources and next steps, especially if you're a classroom teacher, is the Computer Science Teachers Association. I highly, highly recommend this group. It's a great dedicated group of teachers. It's completely free. If you go to csteachers.org nationally, you register there, and then you attach yourself to the Central Virginia District. I went ahead and created the link to the Central VA District. There technically are 2 other chartered chapters in state, but neither are active. And so the Central Virginia one really is looking at how they can start to serve the rest of the state. And I know they've got some meetups planned this spring. So they're a great, great group. And, they're a really good place. Like if you're just feeling overwhelmed and just need to ask like another classroom teacher a question, they're incredibly generous with helping out with things like that. So, all right. So just to cover real quick. Oh, shameless ask. Yes, I will email out certificates of participation. I need to put that together, but absolutely we can do that. So in terms of the educator training we offer, again, we do a lot of different levels. So I'm just scrolling through our website here. So our elementary trainers, we have 2 different programs. We offer 1-day sessions, and those are meant for like a classroom teacher that just kind of needs a boot camp to get started. And then we also have our Elementary Coaches Academy. That is a 5-day training in the summer with follow-up Saturday sessions. The Coaches Academy is meant to train people who would be doing professional development. And the middle school level, we offer a couple different things. We have Project Guts, which is incorporating computer science into science classes. We've run that program for 3 years now. We have some fantastic trainers with that program. And that, I think, in particular, will really be helpful for folks grappling with those modeling and simulation pieces. For the elective, we also have Computer Science Discoveries, so that maps to that elective. Long-term, next year, we are planning on offering a middle school coaches program. For the Coaching Academy, do you have to be an elementary teacher? It really depends on your division. So, like I said, sometimes those folks are instructional resource teachers or ITRTs. It really is up to the division to say, yes, this person is somebody who will be doing professional development. Right now in our pilot, most of those folks are either assigned to an elementary school or have a pretty strong grounding in elementary school. But again, it's a pretty eclectic group. We've got media specialists, we've got ITRTs, we've got STEM coordinators, all kinds of different folks participate there. So, that's something, if you have specific questions, we can certainly work with you. The goal in terms of the K-5 Coaches Academy is where there is demand to be able to train at least 1 coach per elementary school across the state. Because, this is such a heavy lift for teachers. And obviously I think for middle school, as that program gets developed next year, to really start to look at that also and make sure that teachers have on the spot what they need in terms of getting questions answered. And then at the high school level, this coming summer, we do a program called Exploring Computer Science. That maps really nicely to that Computer Science Level 1 course. And then we also have training for AP Computer Science Principles. We've been doing Exploring Computer Science since 2014, so this summer we'll be working with cohorts, probably our 9th and 10th cohorts this summer, which is kind of exciting. So we've got some of those programs we've been running for a very long time, very experienced facilitating group, and they're really, really strong resource. Yes, I will be publishing the slide deck, and in that document at the beginning, I'll put a link in that the resources list so you all can get to it. So yes, that will absolutely be available. Any last minute questions as we're kind of winding down? The Exploring Computer Science mostly maps probably to the CS Foundations. Like I said, we've been running that training for quite some time. A lot of districts, because CS Foundations didn't exist before, a lot of districts were actually mapping that on top of IT fundamentals. More STEM teacher positions created to support the CS standards. I mean, in my heart, I want to say we're going to see more CS teacher positions created, but realistically, I think a lot of divisions are kind of moving in that direction, and there's, I think, just such a natural overlap. And we're seeing a lot of divisions too start to really look at instructional coaching and integration coaching and those pieces. And so I think that for those positions, you know, honestly, it's not really the same position, but it's exciting to see them really thinking about that coaching piece for classroom teachers really becoming a reality in a lot of divisions, and moving beyond sort of how do I do email, how do I do a database, and really thinking deeply about our instruction. So I would certainly hope that those STEM positions would start to go more in place to help. I'm just kind of going through. Oh, absolutely. Yep. And I would say too that that's true for all of our training programs. We assume everybody coming in has not necessarily ever had any experience with computer science. We do a lot of differentiation in the training itself. So a teacher who has been teaching computer science for a while will get things out of it, especially in terms of tools and pedagogical strategies. But we assume that everybody coming in from elementary all the way through, that this is their first taste. So yeah, we don't want to assume that anybody is already an expert. So, well, thank you. And I'm just reading through the comment about the that it's helped the connections. I hope that was helpful. If there's anything that you all would find helpful, please, please, please reach out. We're planning on about 2 of these a month through the winter and into the spring, but I've intentionally not filled up the schedule. I kind of want to hear from teachers as people are going what they need. We've talked about having some of our facilitators come in and present on topics like a deep dive on data or some of those kinds of pieces. So I think there's, you know, whatever you all need, that's the intention for these. We have scheduled our next one. February 1st is the next webinar, and that one is going to be an overview of CodeVA's training program. So going in more depth about what training we offer, what those look like, and getting resources out about that. I'm sorry, I read teachers. I'm sorry, my brain is so much around. The question is that CS Foundations, it can be for students who have never coded. And my brain is so much wrapped up in professional development right now, I misread that. No, absolutely. You know, a lot of students that come into that class have never coded before, have never seen it. And so it's actually something they spend a fair amount of time on in that professional development is how do you handle that? Because you have kids come in who maybe have been to camp or they've done an extracurricular or they had a middle school teacher do it. And then some kids who've never seen it at all. And so there are strategies that they actually very intentionally cover there about how do you differentiate your classroom to make sure every student is welcome and included. And it's a huge, huge part of all of our programs is that diversity piece, is really talking about how do we invite more kids in. You know, I'm sure nationally you've heard there is a lot of discussion right now about diversity in the technology field. And so that is one of our core principles as we design trainings, as we design curriculum, is to make sure that we're inviting all students in. And, you know, over our last 4 years, our middle and high school programs have run 47% female, which kind of knocks that out of the ballpark. You know, the average nationally tends to be 18 to 20%. So that's something we really, really pride ourselves on and really put a lot of emphasis on in the training. STEM for all, exactly. The high school classes mapped to a specific department? No, unfortunately. That is something that will have to eventually come down from the Department of Education. Math, CTE, or depends. I don't know. I know we've had several calls with them about this. And, you know, there are a lot of pros and cons. Math teachers, many have taken some coding classes before, so there's an advantage. But in a lot of districts, there's a shortage of math teachers. And so you can't, you know, when you're running low on teachers, it's hard to justify taking someone to teach an elective. So I know those are the kinds of conversations the DOE is having right now, and hopefully we'll start to get some guidance about that soon. There's even a chance it may be completely left up to local decision. So we don't know what that looks like yet. As soon as I do know, we'll certainly probably do another webinar. I know one thing that we've had a request for is talking about teacher endorsement at the middle and high school level. So as we get some more clarity around that, we'll share any information we can. So. Awesome. All right, well, I ran over 3 minutes. As you can tell, I was a classroom teacher for 20 years. I can talk your ear off. But like I said, if you have questions, if you have like, hey, I would love to see this, or I'm getting this question back in my school, please let us know. We certainly would love to share with you and make sure that you have those resources